Welcome to Spruce Grove Alliance Church, your home.
Well, the theme for our new ministry year, as we've said, is Step Into His Story. This new ministry year that starts July 1st to June 30th is all about story. And this summer, we're going to launch that by looking at Old Testament characters who stepped into God's eternal story and were used in amazing ways. And we're calling this series Somebodies of the Old Testament. Stories of surrender. Nobodies who became somebodies because they surrendered to God. It was not their ability, but their availability that qualified them to be used in God's eternal story. And so we're going to look at like 10 or 11 characters, a new character every single Sunday. And these characters that we're going to look at in the Old Testament are very much what Paul talked about from 1 Corinthians 1, of God choosing the foolish and the weak and the lowly and the despised things of this world to be part of his eternal work. The things that the world get, whatever, they don't matter. And God says, no, I'm going to use you. I'm going to use you in my eternal story. So today we are going to look at the famous story of Gideon. And I'm going to try something brand new today, something I've never done before. I am going to have a special guest join me for my sermon, and we wrote this sermon together, and we are going to do a joint sermon. So I'm going to ask my daughter to come join me for this sermon. And my family doesn't know this, so this is a surprise to them, okay? My daughter, Leah, she is a student at Vanguard. She is hoping to go into children's ministry someday. She is a familiar face over in the children's ministry. She serves every single week teaching grade 1 and grade 3 sometimes. All of them. And doing VBS and things like that. And so I thought, since she's a familiar face over there, and I'm a familiar face over here, and we have our kids with us this morning, we're going to look at this famous story of Gideon, and we're going to do a bit of a two-headed monster. She's going to do a part, and then I'm going to do a part, as we look at this nobody who became a somebody and was used in God's eternal story. Now, kids, where are all the kids? You got a little packet when you came in, and it looks something like this with this Gideon. And all of these words here, God, Gideon, Bible, Lord, Midianites, and trust. And so you, from now on until the end of the sermon, if you hear us say any one of those words, you put a little tick and a tally next to that, and you keep track of that, and you go take it to Pastor Debbie in the foyer after the service, and she has a prize for you. And I say, too, if you want to put something at the bottom there, in honor of my mother, because my mother is here this morning, and she watches every single one of my sermons online. She loves it when I put my hands in my pockets. And by love it, meaning, she's like, do you have to put your hands in your pockets? But so you count how many times Pastor Brent puts his hands in his pockets. That's already 3, okay? Put that down, and you go see my mom, and my mom will give you a prize. No, she's not. That'll come back to bite me. But Pastor Debbie might give you an extra prize if you get the number right. 1, 2, which hand? Anyway. Here we're gonna jump into this. Okay, Leah, why don't you start us? How many kids like this guy up here, Batman? You'll like this.
So yeah, there's this superhero. I don't know if you know him. His name's Batman. Just a little bit of a superhero. A number of years ago, there was this little boy. His name was Miles Scott. Miles was a cancer survivor. And through the Make-A-Wish Foundation, he had one simple wish. He said, I want to become Batman for a day. So something incredible happened. The city of San Francisco transformed itself into Gotham City. Thousands of volunteers came together. Police officers joined. The mayor declared it Bat Kid Day. The president even sent him a congratulatory message. More than 12,000 people lined the streets cheering him on. Batman picked him up in his Batmobile. Together, they rescued a damsel in distress, captured the Riddler, chased down the Penguin. And at the end of the day, Bat Kid was presented with the key to the city. Can you imagine being a little kid and suddenly finding yourself living inside the world of your favorite superhero? There's one picture from that day that I absolutely love. It's the one in the center of the screen. At the very end, Batkid simply looks up at Batman, and you can almost hear what he's thinking. I cannot believe I got to do this. I got to be a part of Batman's story. He didn't create the story. He didn't organize the story. He simply said yes when he was invited into it. So this summer, we're going to meet ordinary people from the Old Testament who experienced something very similar. They didn't write the story. They weren't the heroes. God invited them to step into his story. Today, we begin with a man called Gideon, a man who never imagined God could use someone like him. Yet, God invited Gideon into one of the greatest stories in Israel's history. And as we'll discover this morning, God is still looking for ordinary people who are willing to step into his story.
Not bad, eh? So Gideon is what is known as a judge, okay? So Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges. So before Israel had kings, they had these people called prophets, and prophets spoke on behalf of God. If God wanted to tell the people something, he would tell this prophet, and then he would tell the prophet to tell the people, here's what I want you to do, okay? So they weren't a democracy, they weren't a monarchy, they were a theocracy, and it came through the prophet, okay? But the problem was that the people of God never always listened to the prophet, and they found themselves in trouble. And so when you read this book, aptly named Judges, you find it's kind of like Groundhog Day or deja vu. It's like it's cycle that repeats itself 7 times, ironically, where the Israel is doing well and they're serving the Lord in obedience, and all of a sudden they disobey. And they fall into sin and idolatry, and then so they get into some consequences of slavery because of their sin. And so then they repent, and then God raises up a judge to rescue them. And there's the list of all the judges. You see Gideon at number 5. That's what we're looking at today. And then they restore, and then they obey, and then all of a sudden it's Groundhog Day again. And they do this whole cycle over and over and over, and then God sends another judge, and then God sends another judge, and they just repeats this whole cycle over and over and over again. Now a judge, we think of a judge like a courtroom, and it's something like what we think of it today, but a judge simply makes a determination of what is right and wrong and gets you on the right path, right? A judge makes a determination of what is right and wrong and gets you on the right path, sometimes with authority, sometimes forcibly. That's what a judge does. And a judge, God's judges, they got people on the right track spiritually. And sometimes they had to use a little force. Sometimes they had to do some things that were unorthodox, but they got people on the right path. And that's why they're called a judge. And so we're going to look at Gideon today, a nobody who became a somebody, as God selects him to be part of his eternal story. And we're going to see in this story the kind of person that God uses in his eternal story. So Leah, why don't you start us off reading this story?
The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountains, clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern people invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkey. They came up with their livestock in their tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them on their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites, and they cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose lands you live, but you have not listened to me." The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash the Abizrite, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in a winepress to keep it from the Midianites. When the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, he said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The Lord turned to him and said, "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." The Lord answered, "I will be with you."
It's not as easy as it looks reading it from up here, is it? You struggle with the same thing I struggle with. I read it too fast. Anyway, the kind of person that God uses in his eternal story are somebodies who let God shape their identity, not their fear. They surrender their fear. And here we see when this angel comes, God represents himself as an angel coming to Gideon. We see a theme here that is throughout the whole Bible when God calls someone into his story. This sense of like, who am I? And fear sets in. All of Israel is in fear from the Midianites. Gideon is living in fear, and he's threshing grain in a wine press, which was unorthodox. They wouldn't normally do that because there's no wind in there. And he's living in fear, and the angel comes to him and says, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." And he's like, "What, who, me? No, I'm not a mighty warrior. How can I save Israel? I'm the weakest. I'm the smallest. I'm the least." So before Gideon is even used as a mighty warrior, or even feels like a mighty warrior, God speaks to him, living in his fear, and gives him this identity of mighty warrior. Now, Leah wants to tell you a little bit of her story when it comes to fear and stepping into God's story. Go ahead.
So growing up as a pastor kid, I gave one rule to myself: do not become a pastor. That was the plan. I watched my dad do ministry, and while I knew God was using him, I also saw the long hours, the difficult conversations, and the pressure that came with it. I remember thinking, Lord, that's amazing for someone else, not me. If you'd asked me back then what I wanted to do, my answer would have been literally anything but ministry. Then my best friend said she was applying to Vanguard Bible College and told me I should apply too. I wish I could say I was full of faith, but honestly, I was just thinking, well, I guess it couldn't hurt. So I applied. I didn't have some dramatic lightning bolt moment where I suddenly knew my entire future. I just took one step. But through my time at Bible college, God began to show me something I'd completely missed. When I looked back on my life, I realized he'd been preparing me all along. Ever since I was little, people kept telling me I had a gift for working with kids. I served in children's ministry. I worked with kids at my part-time job, and over people encouraged me in that gifting. At the time, I thought they were just random compliments. But looking back now, I see they weren't random at all. They were moments where God was shaping me for something I couldn't see yet. The biggest obstacle wasn't God's ability to use me. It was my belief that he couldn't. I was scared. I felt inadequate. I questioned whether I was capable. I thought God surely had better, more qualified people to choose from. But I learned that God isn't looking for people who think they got it all together. He's looking for people who are willing to trust him. It was not my ability, but my availability. I realized I had a choice. I could spend my life chasing the story I'd written for myself, or I could find the purpose in the story God was already writing for me. And I'm so thankful I chose this story, because what I once tried to avoid has become one of my greatest joys. Ministry isn't just a job, it's my calling. And every time I get to teach a child about Jesus, watch them ask questions about their faith, or see them understand God's love just a little bit more, I am reminded that God's plans were so much better than mine. So if there's one thing I've learned, it is this: God does not call people who feel the most qualified. He calls ordinary people who are willing to say yes, and then he equips them along the way.
Yeah. And so just like Leah, Gideon didn't let fear define him. He let God define him as he stepped into God's story. And what happens next is he does something that could be considered pretty scary in those days. The Israelites had built these idols all over the place, and God calls him to go tear down his father's idols to Baal and Asherah. And he did it at night. Now my father is here, and if you were to approach him about a story that happened when I was young, and I can barely remember it, kind of like these kids up here, is my dad had this little road grader, and he's starting to laugh right now and knows exactly what I'm talking about. And he gave this road grader to me to play with when I was a child. And this road grader wasn't working properly according to my standards. And so I took the one and only tool that I know to this thing to fix it: a hammer. And I beat the living daylights out of this road grader, and I can tell you that I remember my dad said he was rather upset with me at the time. Now, thankfully, it wasn't an idol for him, but these were idols of his fathers. and they had their talons in the soul of his family and the people of Israel. And so you can imagine when Gideon is called to go step out and to first be this judge and restore Israel and set what's right and get rid of what's wrong in Israel, how much fear could have set in. But he didn't let that define him. And the point being that when God calls us to participate in his story, there's always the potential of fear, and we need to surrender our fear. We can't let that define us. We need to let him give us the identity. Leah here, her gift is that she has this amazing ability to set the tone of the group that she's in. And we've seen this as a child, even when she played on volleyball teams. And so even when she wasn't on the court, we would watch her on the bench and we could hear her above everyone else. And one of the things that I remember her saying over and over again as we watched her encourage her volleyball team was, "You got this, you got this, you got this, girls, you got this, girls, you got this." And recently we were driving somewhere and she took a phone call from a friend in Bible school in the back seat, and I listened to her have this conversation with someone, and they were facing this thing in their life that was going to be potential fear. And I remember those words came out, but with an addition. She said, "You got this because God's got this." And that's essentially what God is telling Gideon. You got this because I got this. You're a mighty warrior because I'm a mighty God. And I'm going to be with you. And that's what God tells Gideon. Okay, so let's read what happens next as we see the second character trait of a person that God uses in his eternal story.
Now all the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples joined forces and crossed over the Jordan and camped into the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord came on Gideon, and he blew a trumpet, summoning the Abiezrites to follow him. He sent messengers throughout Manasseh, calling them to arms, and also into Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. So they too went up to meet them. Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have promised, look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." And that is what happened. Gideon rose early the next day. He squeezed the fleece and wrung out the dew, a bowl full of water. Then Gideon said to God, "Do not be angry with me. Let me just make one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered in dew." That night God did so. Only the fleece was dry. All the ground was covered with dew.
This is the famous fleece story of Gideon. And I think this is often misunderstood, but I see this as a really good thing. This is Gideon trying to keep in step with God's will in his life. One of the things that I always tell our staff is from Galatians 5, to keep in step with the Spirit. That I don't want us as a staff to always to be running ahead of God and trying to pull him to our thing, or lagging behind where God's trying to pull us to his thing, but to keep in step with the Spirit. And I see this is Gideon keeping in step with what God has already called him to do. He's like, "You called me to be a warrior to the Midianites, and there's this opportunity before me, but I'm not sure. Is this what you want, Lord?" Last year we did this series called Holy Listening. Remember this? How do we hear God in the everyday? And we talked about the will of God being these concentric circles. And God's never going to ask you to do something personal, your will, outside of his moral and his sovereign will. His sovereign will is what God is already doing throughout eternity. I'm going to create the earth. I'm going to make male and female, okay? And I'm going to send Jesus to the earth. You didn't vote on it. He's just going to do it. That's a sovereign, eternal will that he's going to do. Then there's his moral will, the things that we don't have to pray about, right? Do I cheat? Do I lie? Do I steal, God? Oh, no, it's so unclear. Do I punch him in the face? No, you don't have to pray about that, okay? And God will never ask you to do something outside of his moral and his sovereign will. And we said this, the more familiar you are with his sovereign will, and the more surrendered you are to his moral will, the easier it is to hear the personal will of God for your life. And it's all right to ask God when it comes to these opportunities that come your way to say, "God, is this part of your plan for my life? I think this is part of your sovereign will. I think this is, I'm submitting to your moral will, but is this what you want for me?" And so I see Gideon doing the same thing. Gideon is here, and God has already called him to be a mighty warrior that's going to save Israel, to go judge and set things right, and go attack the Midianites. And there's this opportunity before him. He says, I just want to be clear, because if I get this wrong, this could be horribly wrong, right? This could go horribly wrong. All right, Leah has an object lesson she wants to.
So I want to show you something I did for a kids lesson I did in children's ministry a couple of months ago. So this is a broomstick, if you cannot tell. It looks hard, but balancing a broomstick on your thumb is actually much easier than you think. Most people think that the trick is to stare at their thumb, or watch the middle of the broomstick, or even watch what everyone else is doing, but if you do that, it almost always falls. The only way to keep the broomstick balanced is to keep your eyes fixed on the very top. As long as you're focused on the top, your hand naturally makes dozens of tiny adjustments without you even knowing it. Okay, careful. But the moment that your focus shifts down to your thumb or to someone else or onto the broomstick itself, everything gets out of alignment and it falls. I think that's exactly what's happening with Gideon here. The fleece wasn't about avoiding God's will. It was about seeking God's direction. Gideon wanted to keep his eyes fixed on God so he could stay aligned with where God was leading him. And the same is true for us today. When we keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, he guides us. He makes us small adjustments we need along the way. But when our eyes become fixed on our fears or our circumstances or what everyone else is doing, it's easy to lose our spiritual balance.
So somebodies continually seek God's direction within his story. So after Gideon has received this confirmation with the fleece, let's see what happened next. We're going to see the third character trait of the person who's used in God's eternal story.
Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, this is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into the hands of Israel, would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." So 22,000 men left, and 10,000 remained. But the Lord said to Gideon, "There are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, "Separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink." 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. The Lord said to Gideon, "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home and kept the 300, who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Then Gideon said, "When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp below yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on one another with their swords.
Now, can you imagine being Gideon, and God's already called you to this enormous task, and you're feeling a little bit scared anyway, and he says, "No, I want to make you weaker. I want to make you weaker right now. And so let all these men go away." And so 22,000 leave, and then all of a sudden he's left, and even more leave, and all he's left with just 300 against this vast army of the Midianites. And here is where we see a theme that's consistent with the rest of Scripture, that God calls us sometimes to do the opposite of what comes natural. He calls us to become weak so that he can show himself to become even stronger. And he calls us to do the complete opposite of what comes natural. And it's kind of like a Chinese finger trap. Have you ever seen one of these, maybe as a gag gift? Leah, why don't you put your finger, you probably have to use.
I don't know if I want to.
Yeah. So we pull on this This actually makes it tighter on our fingers, and there's absolutely no way, unless we could probably rip it, but there's no way that we can get out of this. So if we pull with all of our strength, we're going to make it tighter. The only way to get out of this is to do the opposite of what comes natural. It's to push. We make ourselves weaker, and then we can actually get out of this Chinese finger trap. And this is what God calls Gideon to do, to surrender his strength. Somebody's trust God's power more than their own. And God reduced Gideon's army from 32,000 to just 300. And humanly speaking, this absolutely makes no sense whatsoever. And what we see here is that God calls us to be weak so that he can be strong. God loves to stack the odds against himself so that he can come through and shine more of his glory through us when we're weak. And when we surrender, we have what I like to call this invincible weakness because God is with us. Leah, why don't you take it?
There's a scene in the movie The Lion King that might help us understand this. My family and I went to see this familiar story as a Broadway show in Edmonton last summer. And there was this scene that gave me chills. Young Simba wanders into an elephant graveyard, and it confronted with these hyenas that wanted to destroy him. Young Simba lets out a little roar, but it comes out as a tiny, unimpressive screech. The hyenas laugh uncontrollably, and they move closer. Simba roars again, but this time it was a loud, thunderous roar. And when they did this in the live theater, it made the whole audience jump. What young Simba didn't know is that his father, Mufasa, had arrived just in time and moved in behind him. His roar sent the hyenas running in terror as he rescues his son. We may feel inadequate, but when we step out in the faith into God's story, we don't stand alone. Our Father stands behind us with infinitely greater power than ours. This is what Gideon experienced as he stepped out in faith into God's story. And we can expect the same. When you step into God's story, you never step into it alone. The God who calls you is the God who goes with you.
So let's land the plane here. The kind of person that God uses in his eternal story are somebodies who surrender their fear. They let God shape their identity, not their fear. They surrender their will. They continue to seek direction from God within his story, and they surrender their strength. They trust God's power more than their own. You know, this reminds me of a story that I used to tell when I was a youth pastor, and I maybe even used it once here. It's a story of this king that was growing old, and he didn't have an heir to his throne. And so he decided that he was going to put out a competition to all the young men in his kingdom to decide who was going to be the next king. And so all these men showed up into his kind of courtyard in his palace, and he explained that he was getting old and he didn't have an heir to his throne, and so he needed to choose a new king, and he needed to choose a good man, a man of character, a man who was going to do the right thing even when nobody else did. And so he announced he was going to do a competition for a year. And he gave every single one of these young men a pot of soil. And he said, buried beneath the surface of that pot of soil is a seed that will grow a tree. And he said, here's your assignment. Take that pot of soil home, and every single day, place it in the sun and water it. Do that every single day, and 1 year from now, come back, and I will choose the next king. And so all of these young men go, oh, great, this is a tree growing competition. They take it home, and soon all these little saplings started coming from these pots. Except in one little home, this guy's name was Ling, nothing, absolutely nothing came from this pot. 1 month went by, 2 months, 3, 6, 8 months went by, and nothing came out of this pot. And every single day, he did exactly what the king told him to do. He placed it in the sun, and he watered it every single day. And all of his friends had all of these big trees, and they were bragging about the size of their trees, and they were making fun of him. And he's like, what's wrong with me? How come I can't grow a tree? But every single day, for 1 whole year, he did exactly what the king told him to do. Well, that year came to an end, and he summoned all of these young men to bring their pot to the courtyard, and he was going to make a decision on who was going to be the next king. So these boys stood proudly beside their tree, and this guy named Ling, he didn't even know he was going to show up, but he showed up just last minute, and he put his pot down at the very back in the corner, hoping that no one would see him, a bit embarrassed, as everyone else stood proudly beside their tree. the king started walking down row after row after row after row, looking at all of these pots, and he had this rather concerned look on his face until he came to the very end and he sees this guy named Ling. He sees this guy with his empty pot, and a loud voice says, "Boy, is this pot yours?" And the kid, Ling, he didn't want to look up because he thought he was going to be scolded and shamed. He says, "Yes, it is." And then all of a sudden, he says, "Behold, your next king." And everyone around was completely astonished. "What do you mean?" And they were frustrated with the king. "What do you mean? He can't grow a tree. How is he the next king?" And he quieted the crowd down. He stood up on his throne and he said this, "1 year ago, I gave you a pot of soil with a seed in it. And I told you to put it in the sun and water it every single day. And I told you there was a seed buried just beneath the surface. But what I did not tell you is this, is that before I planted that seed, I put all of those seeds in an oven and I baked them and I killed them. And none of those seeds could have grown." Oof. Oof. He said, "I was looking for a good man, a man who would do the right thing even when no one else did. And I found my man." See, the kind of person that God uses in his eternal story is a surrendered heart to the king. The one that says that they're going to do what the king says, even when it doesn't make sense, even when those around don't, even when it's difficult. He's looking for a surrendered heart, where we surrender our fear, we surrender our will, and we surrender our strength. These are the nobodies that God makes somebodies in his eternal story.
Thanks for listening to this week's message from Spruce Grove Alliance Church. For more information or to hear past messages, please visit sgac.net.